So, what do you think of when I say the name George Washington? What do you think of? What? First president of the United States. Okay, that's kind of the answer I was kind of expecting. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, George Washington, you might be thinking about the $1 bill. Or maybe like the story of the cherry tree that he never actually really cut down, but it was a lie to make him look cooler. Maybe you think of that. Or, maybe you think about him, crossing the Delaware, right? Or, he did a lot of things that are worth remembering him for, right? He was the commander of the First Continental Army. He was the first president of the United States. He was the father of our nation, right? If you're critical of George Washington, you might say something like, well, he had slaves, right? Although he explained in his writings that he knew that slavery would have to eventually go away in a free country, and his slaves were freed after his death. You might say that he was a bad military tactician, and he made a lot of errors there, but he did defeat the greatest superpower in the world at the time. You might say, well, he had wooden teeth. How many people have heard that before, that he has wooden teeth? How many of us know that that's not actually true? He didn't have wooden teeth. He did not have wooden teeth. He actually had dentures that were made from hippo ivory and human cadaver teeth, and they were set in lead. Those are actually George Washington's teeth. So now you know why he doesn't smile in pictures. That's exactly why. But I mean, the man loved sugar, and basically back then the dentists were also the local blacksmith or the local hairdresser. So I mean, that's what you get if that's what you're doing, okay? Now, my wife loves George Washington. Like, she loves George Washington. If he were alive today, I would be very jealous and suspicious if he came around, right? Now, the reason that my wife loves him isn't because of his wealth or his fame or his power or his 6'3" stature, right? My wife loves reading about his character, right? His morality, the things that he was good at. Matter of fact, Rufus Griswold wrote this about him. He said, in moral qualities, the character of George Washington is the most truly dignified that was ever presented to the respect and admiration of mankind. There is no shortage of writing out there about his morality, his conduct, and his wisdom. So when you think about George Washington, there's actually a lot of things to consider, right? His military achievements, his national service, his character, his manners, his leadership. If you go anywhere in our country today, you will see his name and his face, right? If you look at our postage stamps, you might see his face. If you look at our money, you see it. At statues, monuments, the names of states, you see him in history books constantly. Some of us, even in this room, live in a small town that used to be called Holland's Grove, but changed its name in 1837 to what? Washington, which was changed to be named after George Washington. So if we take all of those things together, right, what I just talked about George Washington, what do you call that? That is his what? His legacy. That is his legacy. The definition of legacy is this: the long-lasting impact of particular events, actions, or etc. that took place in the past or a person's life. There is probably no American legacy quite like the one that George Washington left behind, okay? However, we've been learning about another legacy since October of last year, so it's quite a long time we've been looking at this guy's legacy. We've been learning about a man named Abraham, who was also the father of a nation himself. Not the United States, but actually a much older nation, one that began 4,000 years ago, and in a sense, it still exists today. But he also fathered more than a nation. He fathered many nations. He also fathered many races and religions, and even the hope of salvation for every person through history. So today we're going to be entering into the last message of our series about Abraham. Now next week we're going to start a new series in 2 Peter, and it's called Stand Firm. So, and what we're talking about in this series is basically, this is Peter's last writing before he knows he's going to die. So we get kind of his final thoughts, the things he wants to make sure that he leaves behind. So it's really kind of Peter's legacy in a way, but it's talking about Jesus' legacy. And it's kind of a follow-up to the series that we did when I first got here in 1 Peter called Redemption. So this book, 2 Peter, it's an incredibly interesting book. His last words before he dies, and a lot of warnings and things like that. So, I mean, he literally wrote it for future generations because he knew that this was his last chance to speak out. But today we're going to be looking at Abraham, and he's going to come to the end of his life, okay? The end of instituting his legacy. And we're going to look at what his legacy means for mankind. So if you're following along with your YouVersion Bible app this morning, today's message is called Legacy of the Faithful. We're going to be in Genesis 25, looking at verses 1 through 11, but we're also going to bounce around to a lot of external text from this as well. So be ready for that if you want to do your Bible page-turning aerobics. So let's go ahead and go to Genesis 25, verse 1, and see how this goes. Verse 1, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah, And she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letishim, and Lumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Aphor, Hanok, Abida, and Eldaah. All these were children of Keturah. Now, first question, how many of you are impressed that I just read all those names right now? Me too, I didn't practice, so I was a little worried about that. So here's the thing. We often forget that Abraham took another wife after Sarah. Right? We forget that Keturah is there because it's kind of like, here's the end of his life, and it's like, and he married this woman, and then he died. So it's kind of like a quick insert, so we don't really know anything about her. But Abraham did marry another wife and had 6 sons with her. And there's nothing wrong with this. Sarah had passed away, right? It's okay to remarry. And he remarried her and had 6 more sons for a total of 8 sons for Abraham. We know that Sarah had one. His name was Isaac. Hagar had one whose name was Ishmael. And then we have the names that I just read from Keturah. Now, we know that God used Isaac to start his chosen people, right? We know that he started the Israelites, the nation that we learn about all the time. But through his other sons, he made even more nations, okay? So we have Ishmael, who started the Ishmaelites, and Midian started the Midianites, and they seem to intermarry because they mention both of them as the ones that kidnapped Joseph later on. But then you have the Edomites, the Amalekites, the Kenizzites, the Assyrians, and it goes on and on and on. All these people that have roots from Abraham, okay? You remember when God changed Abraham's name and what he said to him back in Genesis 17:5? His name used to be Abram, and God changed it to Abraham. And here's the meaning of that. In Genesis 17:5, it says, "No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you." So not just one nation comes from Abraham, but many nations come from Abraham. So if you grabbed your Connect card on the way in, you want to fill in your blanks, here's where we're going to go ahead and get started. All of your fill in the blanks this morning are about Abraham's legacy, okay? So the first one in the list is this. Abraham left a legacy of nations. Abraham left a legacy of nations. If you take a trip around the world, you'll see Abraham's DNA everywhere, right? If you're Jewish, you're part of Abraham's legacy. If you're Arabic, you're part of Abraham's legacy. If you're from South America, there's a 25% chance that you have Abraham's DNA in you. Actually, when you consider how little we know about Keturah and her sons now, that tells us that there are probably millions and millions and millions more people with Abraham's DNA that don't even know it. So really, Abraham is very foundational in the world we live in terms of the population and the nations that we have. But also you can think about what the nations do even today, thousands of years later. Of all the nations that have either official or preferential religions, there are 42% of them. So 42% of the countries on the earth have either an official or a preferential religion, okay? We're not one of them. We don't have an official religion in the United States. But 42% of the countries in the world do. Of the countries that have official religions, 63% of them are Islam, 13% is Christianity, and 2% is Jewish. That would be Israel, obviously. For the countries that have preferred religions, 70% of them is Christianity, 13% is mixed up, and 8% is Islam, okay? So that means all of those are founded by Abraham. The mixed up one might not be as much, but still, right? So Abraham influenced the religions of the countries that we still have today because they came from him. And then there are all the people that have faith today whose nations don't interfere with them. Think about the world around us and countries where you're free to choose your own religion, and they're full of Christians and Muslims and Jews and Baha'is and Yazidis and Rastafari. All of those religions are Abrahamic. That's all part of his legacy. So there's no doubt that God's promise was fulfilled to Abraham that there would be many nations. And with all these kids, what did Abraham do with them? All right, well, let's see what happens in Genesis 25:5. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. While he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. Now, that's important, okay? Now, Abraham was kind. Of course, we all know that he had special plans for Isaac, right? That of all the nations that Abraham would make, only one of them would be called God's chosen people, right? So Isaac is the very special case. But to the rest, Abraham gave them all gifts. They weren't forgotten, but these gifts were significant because they were all sent off to start those nations that we talked about, right? I mean, likely the 6 sons from Keturah probably went to Yemen, Spain, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. And then one of them might have gone to Sumatra, which is like Indonesia. And then the last one probably mingled in with the others and was just kind of spread out. So that's a pretty good spread from the first generation out from Abraham, right? But here's the thing. All that traveling and starting new civilizations or whatever, all that, like, it requires some stuff, right? You're not going to go do that with nothing on your back, right? So Abraham gave gifts so that they would be able to do that. It required gold and animals and people and materials, and Abraham sent them off so that they could go do that. Why? Why would Abraham say, all of you, get out of here? Well, honestly, the answer is simple. Because the promised land was for Isaac. The promised land was for Isaac alone. And so Isaac turned into a group of God's people as well. We read about that in Psalm 105, verses 42 through 45. It says, for he remembered his holy promise and Abraham his servant, so he brought his people out with joy, his chosen ones with singing. And he gave them the lands of the nations, and they took possession of the fruit of the people's toil, that they might keep his statutes and observe his laws. Praise the Lord. So God follows through with his promise in the future. That's what we see here in the Psalms. And so I think the next part of Abraham's legacy is pretty clear. You might not be able to predict it, but I think it's pretty obvious that this is true, that Abraham left a legacy of people. That's your next fill in the blank. Abraham left a legacy of people. See, God promised Abraham that he would have a few things, right? You're going to have land, you're going to have people, you're going to be blessed, and there's going to be faith involved in this, right? Now, for me, if I were to describe myself, I would say, I am a white Christian American. Right? Because I'm talking about 3 different things that I am, right? A white Christian American. But Abraham started the Jewish Jews, okay? Because Judaism is about all of those things, and of course, that's kind of using interchangeably Israel as well, but you get the point here, is that Judaism is about all 3 of those things. It can be your nationality, your religion, and your race, okay? And with those systems starting to spread now, right, where Abraham says, all right, my son Isaac is in the promised land. I already sent Ishmael out a while ago, and then I'm going to send out everybody else, all my other sons. When we see that, we know that Abraham's work is done. His life, the things that God wanted to do through him in this life were done. And that's what we see here in Genesis 25, 7 through 8. It says, these are the days of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. 175 years old. You know, Jim Newcomb turned 80 yesterday, right, Jim? Yeah, he turned 80 yesterday. Can you imagine if you still had another 95 years to go, Jim? That's a lot of concrete to pour. He's had. So here's the thing. I mean, he's out there pouring concrete like he's 25, if you guys saw our beautiful new sidewalk in front of the education building. But the reality is that Abraham lived 175 years serving God. I mean, that is a long time. And after 175 years of traveling and fighting and leading and loving and serving, his time was finally done. And he died, surrounded by all those people that were in it with him. So there's no doubt that Abraham saw and did many, many things. He traveled 1,100 miles to get to the promised land. He faced severe famines. He lied to kings and gave up his wife and got her back twice. He fought armies to save his nephew. He witnessed the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He saw his 90-year-old wife give birth to a child. And then he was prevented from sacrificing him by the voice of God. So when you look at that, you might think, gosh, dang, man, that's a lot of stuff you did in your lifetime. Right? I mean, that's a lot of stuff that Abraham experienced and did. And honestly, the reason that this was done is very simple, but it's a very powerful reason. The reason why all this happened was that he was following God. That's all there is to it. Wild and crazy things happen when you follow God. Here's what the book of Hebrews actually says about him in Hebrews 11, verses 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So there's a very simple formula in that passage. If you really look at it and break this down and think, let me explain each one of these parts in this passage we just read, and it's very simple. If you start with faith in God, you will do crazy things, and at the end you will end up living in God's holy city. That's a crazy formula, but that formula is something that we still live by today as the church, right? We follow God, crazy things happen, and ultimately we look forward to the promise of being with God for eternity. And that's what the story of Jesus expected. Watch this. I think this is really interesting. Let's turn to John 8:38 and think about how Jesus fits into this part of the equation here. John 8:38. And Jesus is talking to the Pharisees who obviously are not big fans of him. And Jesus says, I speak of what I have seen with my Father, and you do what you have heard from your father. Okay, that's what Jesus says to them. And it says, they answered him, Abraham is our father. And Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works that Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. So Jesus is talking about Abraham here, right? You're not the sons of Abraham because you do what Abraham did. Abraham was a good guy, right? Abraham heard the truth of God and he obeyed it, which is what we should be doing, because if not, we end up on the other side of that equation. So here's what the other side of that equation is. Here's what Jesus says to them, which, we always think of like nice hippie Jesus, but sometimes Jesus says things and it's like, wow, mic drop. Here we go. John 8:44, the first part. He says, you are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do what your father desires. That's kind of insulting, but it's 100% accurate. What is it that Satan desires? I mean, look through Scripture. Violence, sexual immorality, lying, stealing, laziness, selfish, anger, whatever, right? All these things, that's what Satan wants. And so if you're not following Jesus and not doing what Abraham did, that's where you end up as the father, or as with Satan as your father, doing what he tells you to do. But that's not what Abraham did. Here's what Abraham did. Let's look at the next fill in the blank here. Abraham left a legacy of faith and obedience. Abraham left a legacy of faith and obedience. See, this is something that we should absolutely be trying to reflect in our walks, right? I mean, Jesus speaks fondly of Abraham, right? He speaks of him in a kind way. He says, you claim to be of Abraham, but you don't do what he did. It's like Jesus is saying, look, I know Abraham. He would want good things. You don't. You know what God says about Abraham? I love this in Isaiah 41:8. God says, but you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen. Then he says, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. God refers to Abraham as his friend. Do you realize that as believers, we are also friends of God? That's how God sees us as well, as friends and as his children? In John 15:13, Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. So not only are we friends of God, but we're recipients of the greatest type of love that somebody can show their friends, because Jesus laid down his life for us, his friends. So the question is, are you a friend of God? Are you a child of God? And I'm asking because friends of God are saved by his life. And so children of God do what God says, right? So let's look at this last chunk here and see how this goes. Genesis 25:9. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, so notice that Ishmael is there now. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah, his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai Roi. So Abraham was placed in that one cave. Okay, and I mentioned when Sarah died that it was big enough for 6 people. That's all that was buried in there, right? And Isaac was the first piece of God's promise to Abraham of having people. That piece of land was the first piece of God's promise of land. And then there's another piece of that promise that I see here as well, right? So we've seen Isaac as the person, the tomb is the land, and then the other piece is this. It says, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son. The blessing of Abraham was transferred to the next person, because that's what God said that he would do, right? It would begin a chain of events where it would go from Isaac to Jacob and, bounce around to all of the descendants of Abraham, this blessing, and eventually to the world, because that's what God promised that he would do. Right? For thousands of years, that blessing has been spreading to billions and billions of people. So that blessing still goes on today. And that first one was when God transferred it from Abraham to Isaac, and it still spreads today. So here's your next fill in the blank. Abraham left a legacy of hope for future generations. This is an important one. Abraham left a legacy of hope for future generations. So don't forget one very important part of God's promise, okay? In Genesis 22:18, it says, "And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." How exactly would Abraham's offspring bless the whole earth? I mean, there's lots of ways for sure, but there's one way that was clearly the most important way that Abraham's offspring would bless the earth. If you look at Matthew chapter 1, it's in your U version if you want to follow along. I'm not going to put it up there because it's really long. But if you look at Matthew chapter 1, beginning in verse 2, it says, Abraham. And then it goes down through this whole line of Abraham's descendants, ending in verse 16 with what name? Jesus. So it begins with Abraham and says, through this line of descendants comes Jesus. And then if you flip over to Luke 3, it goes in reverse. Verse 23 begins talking about Jesus and then runs backwards and ends in verse 38 with what name? Adam. Good try, though. But if you back up to verse 34, it says Abraham. Okay, so that's the thing, is it says Abraham to Jesus, Jesus to Abraham. Jesus is a descendant of Abraham, the promise that God was talking about in terms of blessing the whole earth. That is a very intentional connection. Did you know that Abraham had an opinion of Jesus? Scripture says that Abraham had an opinion of Jesus. In John 8:56, here's what Jesus says. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you're not yet 50 years old. And have you seen Abraham? And Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now that is amazing, church. That means that Abraham actually heard that Jesus was coming, got to see it, and was excited about it. Abraham did that. Because I believe that Jesus came to Abraham as a Christophany. We've talked about that before. That the angel of the Lord appearances are Jesus talking to Abraham. Definitely before Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. And it was likely the voice of Jesus that stopped him from sacrificing Isaac. And there's also a decent shot that when he met Melchizedek, that Melchizedek was actually Jesus. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that Abraham met Jesus in person. The pre-incarnate Christ came and met Abraham. And one of the things that Jesus said was he was going to have his own day. A day when Jesus, the angel of the Lord, the Son of God, would show up in human form on the earth, and whatever details there that Jesus chose to give him, whatever those details were, Abraham rejoiced because he saw Jesus. That is incredible. So let's rewind a little bit and look at what Hebrews says about Abraham sacrificing Isaac in Hebrews 11:19. He considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham believed in resurrection, so he was willing to sacrifice his son. Why would he believe in resurrection? Honestly, I think it's because he saw that Jesus was going to be resurrected. And he said, well, if God can do that, then he can do this. That's why I think he was confident that if he had to sacrifice Isaac, that God would bring him back. So Abraham, in obedience, trusted in Jesus to provide resurrection for others as well, like us. And that's why Abraham was excited about Jesus' day, because he knew that that day would come and that God had used Abraham to make that day come so that Jesus would die for the sins of the world. So Abraham was excited about it. So let's look at the last thing we know that the angel of the Lord said to Abraham here in Genesis 22:15. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. And I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed because you've obeyed my voice. Church, humanity is an ugly thing. We fight in wars. We squash our fellow man for our own benefit. We ruin God's creation. And basically our sin is a black mark in God's story. But because one man decided to listen to God and do what he said, not perfectly, but he did pretty good. Because one man listened to God, his descendants made the way for Christ to come. Thank God for the faith, obedience, and life of Abraham. Do we ever stop to think about what his life actually means for us? Because salvation came through his obedience. So what I'm saying about Abraham today is the best thing you can possibly say about anyone. The best part of his legacy is this. This is your last fill in the blank. Abraham left a legacy of Christ. Abraham left a legacy of Christ. 1,000%, and I think he would agree with me. So my question for you, church, is what is your legacy going to be? How do you live your life? You know, when Ronnie was a little kid, he always wanted to know where we were going. He always wanted to know. And we'd say, you know what, we're going to go get gas, then we're going to go to Target, then we're going to go to the bank. And he'd be like, okay. And he'd sit in the back seat. And then we'd pull into the grocery store, and he'd freak out and be like, you said gas, Target, and the bank. You didn't say anything about the grocery store. And we'd be like, son, calm down. You don't need to know everything. You're just along for the ride. But as Ronnie grew older and he got more mature, he would sit back there quietly. He wasn't worried if we changed plans on him because, honestly, he trusted the people who were driving and making the decisions. He would just sit back there and just do the things that were necessary because he knew that we were taking care of him. When it was time to get out, he got out. When it was time to grab something for me, he did. When it was time to eat, he would let me know. We'd pull into a drive-thru. I'd hand it back to him. He'd distribute it back there to Gracie. That might have been the other way around, but still. Here's the thing, is that sort of trust and cooperation is exactly what Christ asks for us. You know, a lot of times we want to sit in the back seat and just whine and cry and scream because we don't like where Jesus is taking us. I didn't know you were going to do this, God. I don't want to go there. And that's how we do is we throw a fit and we get upset about it. And I'm mad at God because he did this and I wanted him to do this and he didn't do that and it's not fair. And he let this person get away with this. And we're mad about God for the direction that he takes us. But the truth is we're so much better off if we just sit in the back seat and trust him to take us where we're going. And when he asks us to do something, we step in and say, okay, Lord, whatever you want. That's what a life of faith and obedience looks like. That's the life that Abraham modeled for us. And so just like Abraham, God calls us to live a life where we say, okay, God, what's next? You want me to start a ministry? Great. You want me to go to the Far East as a missionary? Let's go. You want me to take time every day to share your hope with my kids every day? Where's my Bible? You want me to love my enemies? Where are they at? Let's do it. Now, personally, church, I don't know what people are going to say about me when I die. I really don't know. Probably a lot of comments about dumb things I've said or whatever, but the truth is this. I hope that if I get to make one decision, one call, one request for how I'm remembered at the time that I die and people look at my legacy, I hope that there's only one component in there. The only thing that matters to me is they say Dan was a man of God who loved people because God loved him. If people can say that about me, then I have a legacy worth living and dying for. And church, my prayer is that we would be a church that lives that same way. That our legacy wouldn't just be about, the business that we've built or the accolades that we've earned, the championships that we've won, how attractive we were, how healthy we were, how fast we could run, how many cars we owned. I would hope that that wasn't your legacy because honestly, people do that kind of thing every day and nobody ever remembers them. Give it 50 years, no one will know what you had. But if you live a life intentionally trying to leave a legacy where people will have a faith that lives on, they might not remember your name, but if your faith is transferred and lived on, and then they pass it on to their kids, and they pass it on to their kids, and they pass it on to their kids, then you have lived a life with a legacy that is completely 100% worth it if you would just sit back and follow God. you.